So the walking gun turrets of the Devastator Centurions got quite a lot cheaper, but also lost their best combo. Let's talk about the unit now, and how their firepower stacks up against a bunch of rivals. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and Centurions, where I thought it would be interesting to take a second look at the Devastator Centurions, particularly at their new lower points cost of 165. Let's talk about their lore and models briefly, go through their datasheet and any buffs and synergies that can be put on them with the Space Marine detachments, and see how their damage stacks up against some of their rivals. Centurions in Warhammer 40k were one of the later innovations in the armories of the firstborn Space Marines before the big Primaris reset that Games Workshop did starting in 8th edition. Basically Space Marines clad in power armor inside giant exosuits, apparently the Centurion warsuit being unearthed in Millennium 36 shortly after the Age of Apostasy, and the design sanctified by the Adeptus Mechanicus being put into production and named for the Space Marine army leaders of old. The overall effect for Astartes inside power armor inside a great big warsuit basically means that the bearer can stride about the battlefield carrying enormous weaponry as essentially small walking tanks, perhaps having some of the advantages of the Dreadnought without having the obvious disadvantage of having to be wired into a sarcophagus within the thing. They were first utilised by the heavy firepower armies of the Imperial Fists and Iron Hands, and are generally deployed as line breakers or siege units whenever mobility is far less important than massive armour and firepower. The suits can bear either enormous close-range assault siege drills or various heavy weapons augmented by chest-mounted firepower for the Devastator variant. I thought I'd focus on the Devastator one today, as it does basically mean that the two have a completely different battlefield role. Miniatures wise, a squad of 3 Centurions is £50, €65 or $80 from Games Workshop currently. Due to them being quite pricey models to field on the table, they're around about 2 points per dollar, which I feel like is sort of middle of the road for Space Marines these days. The price isn't a particularly feel good one for 3 infantry models, even if they are unusually big and chunky ones. The appearance of the models really weren't received very well at all on release for them. Games Workshop having a lot of memes about putting a Space Marine inside a Space Marine and then selling them to us. They certainly go down the tried and tested 40k aesthetic of looking ridiculously bulky and armoured to the point where it looks like they might struggle to walk and use their weapons properly. Though I would say that isn't exactly unusual of 40k models, and I wouldn't say they feel particularly out of place in the setting. I feel like now there's a good amount of people that really quite enjoy them, but still a good amount of people who don't like the appearance versus say some of the new Primaris. Between them, Terminators and Gravis Marines though now, Space Marines are just unusually well served for big chunky guys in exo armour. I quite enjoy building the model kits themselves. They do have a fairly fantastic amount of weapon options, and I feel like there's quite a lot more positive to them after building the kit than before. I'm a bit apprehensive about the possibility of firstborn phase outs affecting these guys though. To me, it feels like they're a unit that could be at risk in a similar sort of vein to, say, the Ironclad Dreadnought or the Hunter and Stalker kit, which was also at least a fairly recent firstborn one. I like the Centurions, they don't usually tend to be at the absolute forefront of Space Marine lore and in the focus of stories. In a recent poll I did, people were divided pretty much 50-50, about half of people thinking that eventually they'd do a Primaris update for these, whereas the other half thinking that they're probably just going to go to Legends without replacement at some stage. Might not necessarily be soon. I guess we'll find out what happens when Games Workshop unleashes their next wave of Primaris between late 10th and 11th edition. In any case, if you were looking to pick up some Centurion models, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers links down in the video description below. They all save a bit of money versus Games Workshop's prices, usually between 10 and 20% depending on where they are around the world. Let's get into the rules though for the Devastator Centurions, and here is their datasheet. They're now 165 points for 3 of them, or 330 for 6. That's down a good amount from 185 or 370. That equates to an 11% points cut, and that's definitely a very solid drop that's big enough to be felt, and does make them a far more efficient damage and defense style unit. As mentioned though, they did lose the single biggest way that people tended to run Devastator Centurions with their combo with Uriel Ventress recently. The idea was that he could give them deep strike in Vanguard Spearhead, and then they could use the return to reserves to basically allow them to repeatedly warp around the table, destroying stuff. Basically getting around their low speed by sneaky shenanigans. Uriel Ventress' ability no longer affects them though, as it locked to certain armour keywords now, and Centurion was certainly not one of them. In any case though, getting into their basic stats, one of their biggest weaknesses certainly is their slow movement characteristic, only moving 4 inches across the board, and that means they're really not so very far from being static gun turrets. They might struggle to get lines of sight with that, and might give them a bit more incentive to being fielded in detachments where they can advance and shoot if they don't have some sort of return to reserves trickery going on. Otherwise, they've got the infantry keyword, which means they can interact well with terrain walls, but also does mean that if an enemy unit decides to tag them in close combat, they won't be firing their big fancy guns, so that's a massive weakness for them, and they absolutely need to be either far enough back that that's not going to happen, or be screened, unless you're in a detachment where you can fall back and shoot with a stratagem or for free. Otherwise, they're OC2, so a little bit of presence on objectives, but not really very much given their points cost, and they do chip in with a few attacks in melee with their Centurion fists, 3 attacks at strength 5 and damage 2. For their durability, I'd rate it as kind of mid. They're 4 wounds each at toughness 7 with a 2+ save, so basically small arms are going to do very little against them, as is anything with low AP, particularly if they get cover. But any dedicated anti-tank firepower with some good AP, or particularly things like Melter Fire if it can get in range, is going to make at least fairly short work of them. Compared with tanks and things, they'll often be weighed up against. A lot of sort of mid to low strength weapons are going to be far more effective against them than the tanks, though I guess it does mean that seriously high strength weapons aren't going to do more than kill 1 Centurion. Being a squad of 3 models as opposed to 1 tough tank also means that the squad effectively degrades a lot more. Basically for every 4 wounds that you lose, then you're losing 1 set of las cannons and a set of missiles, as opposed to tanks where they have to take really quite a lot of damage before they even get -1 to hit, which doesn't always matter that much depending on their supporting rules. In general though, they're certainly a unit that wants to be getting the first strike on the enemy and not the other way around. For the choice of main weapon, they've either got the options of twin las cannons, twin heavy bolters, or a single grav cannon. In 10th edition I just haven't really seen anyone use anything but twin las cannons on Devastator Centurions, at least not in more optimised lists. The las cannons just give you the 1 big shot per Centurion model, but it is twin linked, so to be re-rolling the wound roll, and there's a good chance of re-rolling all failed hit rolls as well from their datasheet rule. Then for their chest weapons, they've got the choice between the Centurion bolters versus missile launchers. Again, this one doesn't really seem to be a particularly close contest against most things in 40k. They don't really particularly need to be a close range anti-horde unit. They'd much rather be a long range general purpose unit, and those missiles can both chip in against tough stuff, but particularly against elite infantry. They're D3 shots each with strength 9, AP -2, damage D3 and blast. That's really quite a nice general purpose profile. Particularly against elite infantry, getting a bunch of extra shots from that will definitely be handy, and there's enough AP and damage to matter against most targets, particularly ones that are toughness 9 or worse. The extra range is definitely nice with the long range las cannons too. Finally, they've got their special rule, which allows them to re-roll hit rolls of 1 all the time, or all hit re-rolls against things on objective markers, and that does make them just very reliable shooting. The objective marker thing maybe sounds a little bit bigger than it is, just due to the fact that you're comparing it against already having the hit re-rolls of 1. It essentially only adds an extra 14% bonus damage output to them if you get that, which definitely isn't nothing on a big shooty unit, but if they've got a better target that isn't on an objective, then it's probably still worth going for that instead. Putting that firepower together, and here's just a very rough idea of their average damage output weighted per the new 165 points. If a Devastator Centurion unit gets to light up these targets, they'd often kill just over 2 Terminators, the blast special rule of their missiles helping out a fair bit against that. Have a good chance to one-shot something like a transport vehicle such as a Rhino, and do around about 7 wounds or so versus a Land Raider. For these numbers, I assume that their target will be on an objective marker half the time, so sometimes they're going to be a bit better than this, sometimes a bit worse, and particularly with the las cannons they will be quite swingy, depending on whether or not your opponent makes some lucky saves or you roll high or low with the damage. In general, their raw damage numbers I think compete very well against most of the competition. They have a similar sort of threat to the Gladiator Lancer, which is a very similar points cost. The Lancer is going to be a bit better against anything that's toughness 10 or higher, but not really by a particularly significant amount in my opinion. And the Centurions are far more general purpose, seemingly having the edge against toughness 9 or lower, and also particularly against elite infantry, where they're far more efficient with the blast keyword on those missiles. The Eradicators beat them for close range anti-tank, though you kind of expect it, given that they need to get far closer to the target, and their special rules are all about destroying monsters and vehicles. Again, they're far less general purpose, and the Centurions can inflict damage from far longer range. And against a few of the other flavours of gun tank, generally the Centurions have better damage numbers, but as mentioned, the trade-offs there are more that the other things can move faster and are probably a bit tougher to kill or tougher to degrade on balance. Overall, their per point damage does seem really quite scary at 165 points. I feel like they do kind of need to be on this sort of level to compete with the advantages of the vehicles, but they do seem to have basically the best damage profile of long-range shooters here, at least when taken as an overall if you don't know what you're going to be firing at. Overall, Centurions definitely feel like a unit with some big pros and cons. Their damage output and shooting is really quite powerful and really quite long-ranged. They get the additional buff if they're shooting against things on objectives, which they'll often be able to, given that opponents are generally going to need to move things up to score. They make great use of cover and Armour of Contempt with their 2+ saves, and are a good target unit for any other stratagems or things that you can help them out with detachments. They are really quite a big dangerous unit that you can layer any extra damage stratagems on, and they are pretty great for any army that can repeatedly teleport them. I still think Vanguard's interesting with the return to reserves. It just means they'd have to walk on from the board edge to light something up, but that still could give them a whole bunch of different shooting options, and in particular Deathwatch Black Spear with their return to reserve teleportarium stratagem. For their downsides, they're very slow at 4 inches, and competing against tanks and dreadnoughts that can move far faster, it means they might often struggle to get lines of sight on the things that they really want to. Being infantry and getting locked in melee could be very bad indeed. They don't have any character options that can join them, which means no enhancements, and they'd be competing against Auspex Marine infantry variants that can have characters join. And as mentioned, they had their recent best combo prevented with Uriel Ventress's deep strike thing for the Vanguard Spearhead. As a result, it does mean unit support is maybe a bit limited, largely just to the things that you can get in detachments. They can potentially make use of Oath of Moment, but compared with other units it does have a bit of redundancy, given that they might have been re-rolling hit rolls anyway, or at least getting the hit re-rolls of 1. Las cannons are pretty much wounding everything in the game pretty well already, it's just maybe the missiles that really benefit from the +1 to wound thing, and that could be good if there's a particularly good target for the missiles, or if they're targeting something that's high toughness, and maybe more useful if the targets aren't already on objectives and triggering those re-rolls anyway. For 1 command point, Armour of Contempt's really quite a strong choice with their 2+ saves. That could have them saving on some seriously impressive numbers, particularly if combined with cover, and they also could be a seriously good unit for Overwatch as well. If taken as a big 6-man squad, then that's just a lot of firepower full stop. You'd be odds on to get a las cannon hit and a couple of missile hits on the target, which could be big enough in itself. So if the opponent moves on to an objective marker, then potentially you could trigger the full rerolls to hit that they get, and that would almost double the damage of the Overwatch that you're getting, and feels like that could be a very easy trade for 1 command point for a bunch of extra damage. Otherwise, to help out their firepower, I'd say perhaps the most useful thing might be something like the Space Marine Stormspeeder Hammer Strike to give them ignores cover. Cover saves are generally pretty relevant on big anti-tank targets for the las cannons, and it could often matter for the AP2 missiles as well. So even with cover, they're still going to be a pretty efficient firepower unit without that. Otherwise, I guess you could use incursors if they're shooting things not on objectives, where that would mean that they'd be hitting on a 2+ re-rolling 1s. If they've already got 4 hit re-rolls against things on objectives though, it does feel a bit redundant. I guess their missiles could occasionally have situational help from the Combi Weapon Lieutenant if the enemies move on to the objective that he marked. You'd have 4 re-rolls to hit against things on objectives, and re-rolling 1s to wound is even more handy. Otherwise, as mentioned, characters can't join them, so not really very many interactions with the character datasheets. Guilliman could give them free stratagems potentially, and I guess they are a big focal unit that could use those quite well, but at the same time that's kind of true of just about any Space Marine unit out there. They're not really going to be too desperate for transports as well. I guess they would like the extra mobility threat range, though I feel like if you're putting Centurions in transports, it's probably going to be the Assault Centurion variant, where they can really use the help to get close and still have immense damage output. I guess in theory, if you wanted to use them as a very alternative firepower unit, you could have something like a repulsor, have them jump out of that, and then have the option to jump back in if the enemy charged them. I feel like it's unlikely that people would generally want to use them that way though. Feels more likely that you'd be putting things like Eradicators or Hellblasters with a Lieutenant combo or something, both of which also cost a fair few more points than the Centurions as well, at least compared with the 3 that you can fit in one of the repulsor tanks. It feels like the main thing that they can gain for Space Marines are the detachment buffs, and there definitely are a few things that could help them out a bit. For Gladius, they potentially like the advance and shoot and the fall back and shoot options. Quite nice to have that as a get out of jail free card if they do manage to get tagged. They'd be quite good users of Storm of Fire there as well. Potentially ignores cover and AP-1 would make their damage output absolutely blistering. Vanguard Spearhead I still think feels like one of the best ways to use them. Cover and stealth at greater than 12 inches works really quite nicely for them as a unit that's going to be afflicting damage from long range. They've got a 1 command point stratagem for a +1 to hit and extra AP if they're a fair way away from the enemy. Again, that's pretty massive, and doubly so if they're not shooting something or an objective marker. But mainly I still think that return to reserves thing is really quite usable on them in Vanguard. It'll just depend on exactly how much ball control the opponent's got. If you're able to just have them walk on from the edge of the board and get some great targets for the las cannons and missiles, then that could be a really big thing. It would be far more limited than when they could combo with Ventress, but on the plus side you don't have to pay for that datasheet anymore if you don't want to. And also if you were taking a 6-man unit of them, the points cost drop down from 370 to 330, so the price of accessing potentially las cannons moving around the board got way cheaper, even if they are certainly more restricted. Otherwise, Firestorm could allow them to advance and shoot, and that could make them a little bit less painfully slow if they are all very ground bound. I guess they could use the +1 to wound stratagem where relevant, which could help out their missiles. Anvil Siege Force maybe feels like a natural home for them, though as ever the locking of things to being static is pretty painful. I guess it's not like they move far anyway, so giving up the 4 inches of movement isn't as painful for a unit giving up far more, but still it's just not going to be doable sometimes when they absolutely need to gain line of sight or something. But there is the potential for some extra damage here, a 1 command point for sustained hits, maybe on a 5+ if they're static, and they do have that option to kind of rescue them from melee. 1 command point to effectively fall back in the enemy fight phase so they can stand and shoot in the next turn. That feels like the majority of the useful things for them. I guess Ironstorm could add the odd single reroll for things they don't have rerolls on already. and Stormlance could use things like the reactive move stratagem, but most of the rest feel a bit more niche. For detachments, as mentioned earlier, Deathwatch feel like they're probably the standout winner for the Devastator Centurions. They've got a 1 command point teleportarium stratagem that could be used to move kill teams around, but people absolutely have been using it on Centurions already in competitive lists, and that was when they were up as a big 370 points for the scary unit of las cannons of them. Now they're down at 330, they're looking even better, and you might have even more people looking at them as opposed to kill teams in competitive armies. They won't be able to make use of the base mission tactics, but they can gain them via the stratagem, so sustained hits for 1 CP could be big enough on a 330 point unit worth of scary guns. Otherwise, most of the rest tend to go a bit more in for melee than ranged things. I guess Blood Angel's Liberator has options to advance and shoot and fall back and shoot, though those same stratagems are the ones used to advance and charge and fall back and charge, so they might be being used there already. Black Templars and Space Wolves both have ways to get them a feel no pain type save, certainly could be relevant enough on big tanky models, and I guess for Dark Angels, on paper maybe Company of Hunters isn't absolutely awful for them. Native advance and shoot and fall back and shoot is pretty handy, they maybe don't really feel like they're going to be playing along very well alongside bike synergies though. Overall, I think with the points cut, they're still an interesting unit for Codex Space Marines. I'd say Deathwatch is probably going to be the strongest way to field them at the moment with that teleportarium stratagem. I have a feeling that we'll continue to see them in more competitive lists there. And otherwise, Vanguard Spearhead I still think looks interesting, in the light of the big points drop down to 330, and there is at least some points saving to not taking Yuri or Ventress. For most armies being used normally, I feel like they're in the spot where they're usable, though I feel like for the majority of competitive games they're still probably going to get out-competed by the various flavours of tanks and dreadnoughts. In tournament games I suspect the speed and durability is going to outweigh a bit of damage efficiency. I feel like there might be a unit that does a little bit better in slightly more casual games, maybe when line of sight blocking terrain and fire lanes aren't quite so hard to come by. If they do get into a position where they can just do long range damage to the enemy right from turn 1, they're probably going to be better there versus really tight boards with low firing lanes and lots of line of sight blockers. I feel like having limited sort of support and not being particularly efficient with Oath of Moment also doesn't really help them too much. And they would have to both compete against Space Marine gun tanks and other infantry with leaders and things, which if you're spending something like 165 points or 330 points on a fire support unit, you could definitely have enough points to access some fancy stuff. They do look interesting though. I feel like just having the raw firepower to outshoot the vast majority of the Space Marine armory point for point at that range is something that could draw people's attention at 165 points. And with the removal of that one combo and just getting better for other lists, maybe makes them a bit more of a well-rounded choice that some people might embrace, even given their downsides. Let me know your thoughts on the Centurions though. Would you be tempted to put some on the table at this points cost? Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. And as mentioned, if you were looking to pick up some Centurions or any other Warhammer 40k models in the near future, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers links down in the video description. As mentioned, they can save a bit of money and also help to support the channel. There's Element Games in the UK here for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Tash and Geldeep in Germany and the EU for 16%. A big thank you to anyone using those when they do pick up some model soldiers, it does help to support the channel. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. I'll certainly have more videos to come for 40k and Space Marines, so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. The channel does have a Patreon page as well, linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support. There's a few things such as seeing certain videos early and occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.